There is something happening around us that many people sense but struggle to explain. It is a feeling that the world has changed, that something deeper than politics, economics, or social trends is unfolding beneath the surface. Most people try to ignore it. Others dismiss it completely. But there are moments in history when ignoring reality becomes impossible. And according to many who have spent decades studying the spiritual life, we are living in one of those moments right now. This is not about fear. Fear alone never helps anyone. It is about understanding what is taking place and recognizing the challenges that stand directly in front of us. Because whether people realize it or not, the battle for the soul has already begun, and countless individuals are walking through it without even recognizing the signs. For more than 20 years, experienced exorcists, spiritual directors, and priests who work closely with people facing extraordinary spiritual struggles have reported something remarkable. Cases involving spiritual oppression, obsession, and other forms of serious spiritual distress have increased dramatically. This is not being described as symbolism or metaphor. For those working directly with these situations, it has become a practical reality. Many priests assigned to this ministry face overwhelming demand, with individuals sometimes waiting months or even years for assistance. The obvious question is why? Why now? Why are so many people struggling in ways that seem deeper than ordinary difficulties? One explanation points to the spiritual and cultural environment that has gradually developed over recent decades. Practices once considered dangerous or spiritually unhealthy have become normalized and even celebrated. Activities that previous generations viewed with caution are now marketed as harmless entertainment or personal wellness. Across modern culture, ideas connected to fortune-telling, astrology, occult symbolism, and various forms of spiritual experimentation have become increasingly common. Entire industries have grown around concepts that earlier generations of Christians openly rejected. What once existed on the margins now appears in mainstream entertainment, social media, schools, and daily conversation. At the same time, many people have lost a clear understanding of spiritual danger. When a culture stops speaking seriously about sin, it often stops speaking seriously about protection as well. If people no longer believe that actions have spiritual consequences, they naturally become less cautious about the influences they invite into their lives. Understanding this requires some precision. Popular culture often focuses on dramatic stories of possession, but many experienced spiritual directors emphasize that full possession is actually rare. Far more common are subtler forms of spiritual attack that affect emotions, thoughts, habits, and daily life. Oppression refers to attacks that come from outside a person, creating discouragement, confusion, temptation, or persistent struggles that seem unusually intense. Obsession involves repeated thoughts and fixations that gradually wear down a person's ability to focus on truth and spiritual reality. Infestation refers to situations where harmful spiritual influences become associated with particular environments, objects, or circumstances. These concepts may sound unfamiliar to many modern people, but throughout Christian history, they have been discussed extensively by theologians, saints, and spiritual writers. What concerns many observers today is not simply the existence of these realities, but the fact that large numbers of people no longer possess the spiritual framework needed to recognize them. Previous generations lived within a culture that regularly reinforced prayer, sacramental life, and religious practice. Church bells marked the hours. Families prayed together. Homes contained visible reminders of faith. Religious customs were woven into ordinary life. Whether people fully appreciated it or not, these practices created a kind of spiritual structure that helped shape daily existence. Over time, much of that structure weakened. Many traditions disappeared. Prayer became less common. Religious practices that once united communities slowly faded from public life. And whenever a vacuum is created, something eventually moves in to fill it. That observation leads to a deeper question, one that many people have never seriously considered. If a culture abandons the habits and beliefs that once guided it, what takes their place? And more importantly, what happens to the people living inside that culture when the foundations that once protected them begin to disappear? The answer to that question may explain far more about our current moment than most people realize. To understand what many spiritual writers have been warning about, We need to look beyond individual behavior and examine the larger environment shaping entire societies. Throughout Christian history, theologians taught that cultures are not spiritually neutral. Ideas influence institutions, institutions influence families, and families influence souls. What begins as a small shift in belief can eventually transform an entire civilization. The early church fathers spoke often about what St. Paul described as principalities and powers. They understood these not merely as abstract concepts, but as spiritual realities capable of influencing the direction of societies. Their writings repeatedly emphasized that when a people gradually turn away from God, the consequences extend far beyond personal morality. Entire cultural systems begin to reflect that separation. When a society normalizes what was once considered destructive, celebrates what previous generations recognized as harmful, and dismisses the sacred as irrelevant, the change is not simply philosophical. It affects the atmosphere in which people live, think, and raise their children. Values shift, priorities change, truth becomes negotiable. Eventually, people lose the ability to distinguish between what nourishes the soul and what weakens it. This is why many observers believe that one of the greatest dangers today is not open hostility toward faith, but widespread indifference. Open opposition can often strengthen conviction. Indifference quietly erodes it. A person may not consciously reject God. Instead, God simply becomes less important. Prayer becomes optional. Worship becomes occasional. Spiritual discipline disappears altogether. The result is that countless people are navigating life without any meaningful spiritual protection. They encounter anxiety, confusion, emptiness, and discouragement without possessing the framework needed to understand what may be contributing to those struggles. Every challenge is interpreted solely through psychological, social, or material categories. Now, none of this means that every difficulty has a spiritual cause. Human beings experience stress, illness, trauma, and emotional suffering for many legitimate reasons. Serious spiritual teachers have always insisted on careful discernment. Yet they also warn against the opposite mistake, the assumption that spiritual realities play no role whatsoever in human experience. Many people today feel constantly exhausted, distracted, and restless. They move from one source of entertainment to another, from one crisis to the next, rarely experiencing silence. Their attention is fragmented. Their interior life is neglected. They spend hours feeding the mind while starving the soul. The consequence is a growing vulnerability that often goes unnoticed. Perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the crisis of faith unfolding across much of the Western world. Statistics reveal a dramatic decline in religious participation over the past several decades. Churches that were once filled now struggle to attract regular attendance. Sacramental practice has declined. Religious vocations have fallen. Entire generations have grown up with little understanding of the faith that shaped their grandparents' lives. These trends are not merely numbers on a page. They represent millions of individuals gradually disconnecting from traditions that once provided meaning, identity, and spiritual direction. Many theologians connect this decline to what Scripture describes as a falling away from the faith. Without making dramatic preachings or claiming knowledge of future events, they observe that many of the conditions associated with serious spiritual crises are already visible. Faith is weakening. Religious literacy is disappearing. Moral confusion is increasing. And perhaps most concerning of all, many people seem unaware that anything significant has changed. Yet beneath every visible crisis lies a deeper cause. The deepest problem is not ultimately political, cultural, or institutional. It is spiritual. At the heart of the crisis is the collapse of interior prayer. For generations, countless believers maintained a daily relationship with God through silence, reflection, sacrifice, and disciplined prayer. They understood that faith was not merely about attending services or agreeing with certain beliefs. It was about cultivating an inner life centered on God. Today, many people still identify as religious, but their prayer life is almost non-existent. They know about God, yet rarely spend time with Him. They participate in religious activities, but the deep interior transformation that once characterized Christian spirituality has become increasingly rare. Without prayer, faith slowly becomes intellectual. Without prayer, morality becomes a list of rules. Without prayer, spiritual strength begins to weaken. And when that happens, people become far more vulnerable to influences they cannot always see, understand, or resist. That vulnerability helps explain why so many individuals who once possessed faith eventually find themselves drifting toward entirely different paths. When a person gradually abandons the faith, the process is rarely as simple as walking away from a set of beliefs. Something much deeper is taking place. Throughout Christian history, spiritual writers have argued that the human soul was created for communion with God. When that relationship weakens or disappears, the soul does not become neutral. It begins searching for something else to fill the space that has been left behind. That is why so many people who leave religious practice do not simply become indifferent. Instead, they often find themselves embracing new ideologies, new spiritual systems, new identities, or new sources of meaning. The human heart was designed to worship. If it no longer worships God, it will eventually give its devotion to something else. This pattern has repeated itself throughout history. Entire civilizations have moved away from religious foundations, only to replace them with political movements, philosophical systems, celebrity culture, material success, personal pleasure, or various forms of spirituality disconnected from traditional faith. The object changes, but the underlying need remains the same. That's many spiritual teachers believe this explains why modern society appears increasingly restless. People have access to more entertainment, information, and convenience than any previous generation, yet anxiety, loneliness, and despair continue to rise. Material progress has solved many practical problems, but it has not answered the deeper questions that every human being eventually faces. Why am I here? What gives life meaning? What happens after death? How should I live? No amount of technology can answer those questions. They belong to the realm of the soul. For this reason, many theologians argue that the current crisis is not primarily about institutions. It is about the interior life. A person can belong to a church, attend religious events, and still lack a genuine relationship with God. Without that relationship, faith becomes fragile. It may survive during comfortable times, but it often collapses when tested by suffering, temptation, or cultural pressure. The saints understood this truth better than anyone. They did not become saints because they possessed extraordinary personalities or exceptional talents. They became saints because they cultivated extraordinary intimacy with God. Their lives were marked by prayer, sacrifice, fasting, self-discipline, and perseverance. They treated spiritual growth as seriously as athletes treat physical training. When difficulties came, they already possessed spiritual strength because they had spent years developing it. Modern culture often encourages the opposite approach. Comfort is prioritized over sacrifice. Convenience is valued above discipline. Immediate gratification is preferred to long-term growth. As a result, many people have never developed the spiritual resilience necessary to withstand serious challenges. This is why so many observers describe the current moment as a time of spiritual testing. Not because dramatic events are necessarily unfolding every day, but because ordinary believers are being asked to choose. They can continue drifting with the currents of culture, or they can intentionally deepen their commitment to God. The middle ground is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Many people have spent years trying to balance faith with a culture that often moves in the opposite direction. Yet the stronger the cultural current becomes, the harder it is to remain stationary. Eventually, a choice must be made. One either moves closer to God or gradually drifts away. Paradoxically, this reality also contains hope. Periods of crisis often produce remarkable clarity. When comfortable compromises become impossible, priorities become obvious. People discover what truly matters. Convictions are tested, commitments are purified. Throughout history, some of the greatest saints emerged during periods of confusion and instability. They did not wait for ideal soul circumstances before pursuing holiness. They responded precisely because the circumstances were difficult, and nowhere is this challenge more urgent than within the family. If there is one area that demands immediate attention, many spiritual leaders would argue it is the formation of children. The next generation is growing up in an environment unlike any previous generation in human history. Never before have young people been exposed to such a constant stream of information, entertainment, ideas, and influences. Every day they encounter messages about identity, purpose, morality, relationships, and truth. These messages arrive through phones, tablets, Computers, schools, social media platforms, and entertainment systems. They are presented continuously, often without interruption. The question is no longer whether children are being formed. The question is who is doing the forming. And for many families, that question has become far more important than they realize. The reality facing families today is unlike anything previous generations experienced. In the past, parents certainly faced challenges when raising children, but those challenges were usually limited by geography, community, and access to information. Today, a child can be exposed to ideas, images, and influences from across the world within seconds. The formation that once came primarily from parents, churches, and local communities now competes with a constant digital stream that never sleeps. This is why many spiritual leaders view the current generation as standing at the center of one of the most significant battles of our age. Children and young adults are not simply being exposed to different opinions. They are being immersed in entire systems of thought that shape how they understand reality itself. From an early age, many are taught that truth is subjective, that identity is endlessly flexible, and that meaning is something each individual creates for themselves. Religious faith is frequently presented as outdated, restrictive, or irrelevant. Traditional morality is often portrayed as a relic of the past. The result is a generation growing up in an environment where the foundations that guided countless previous generations are increasingly questioned or dismissed. At the same time, many young people are struggling with levels of anxiety, loneliness, confusion, and hopelessness that would have been difficult to imagine only a few decades ago. They are connected to everyone, yet often feel isolated. They have access to unlimited information, yet many feel lost. They are surrounded by entertainment, yet frequently report a lack of purpose. For many observers, these trends are not unrelated. Human beings need more than stimulation. They need meaning. They need truth. They need a reason to endure suffering and a vision of life that extends beyond temporary satisfaction. When those deeper needs are ignored, emotional and spiritual confusion often follows. Technology itself is not the enemy. Devices are tools, and like all tools, they can be used for good or ill. The concern arises when these tools begin shaping the imagination of young people more powerfully than parents, teachers, or spiritual mentors. The imagination plays a crucial role in human development. What a person repeatedly sees, hears, and absorbs eventually influences what they desire. What they desire influences the choices they make. And those choices gradually shape the direction of their lives. This is why the content children consume matters so deeply. Stories, music, social media trends, online communities, and entertainment are never entirely neutral. They communicate values. They offer visions of what is good, desirable, and meaningful. Over time, those messages become part of the framework through which young people understand themselves and the world around them. Many parents recognize this problem but feel overwhelmed by it. They know the culture is influencing their children, yet they are uncertain how to respond. Some attempt to ignore the issue. Others become discouraged. Still others feel guilty because they themselves never received the formation necessary to guide the next generation effectively. But guilt is not a solution. Awareness is. The first step is recognizing that the challenge is deeper than politics, education, or social trends alone. Those dimensions matter, but beneath them lies a spiritual struggle concerning truth, identity, and purpose. For this reason, many spiritual teachers insist that the home must once again become a place of formation, not merely a place where people sleep, eat, and watch television, but a place where faith is lived intentionally. A strong family culture does not emerge by accident. It requires prayer, conversation, discipline, and shared practices that continually point family members toward what matters most. Parents cannot outsource this responsibility indefinitely. Schools may assist, churches may assist, programs may assist. But no institution can fully replace the influence of a mother and father who actively participate in the spiritual formation of their children. This does not mean perfection is required. Every family struggles. Every parent makes mistakes. The goal is not flawless performance, but faithful effort. Children need to see faith lived authentically. They need examples of adults who pray, who seek forgiveness when they fail, who prioritize truth over popularity, and who understand that genuine happiness requires more than comfort and convenience. Most importantly, they need a vision worth embracing. Many young people abandon faith not because they have carefully studied and rejected it, but because they were never shown its depth, beauty, and transformative power. They received a watered-down version that seemed incapable of answering life's biggest questions. When that happens, the attractions of the surrounding culture often appear far more compelling. The challenge, then, is not merely to protect the next generation from harmful influences. It is to offer them something greater, something strong enough, meaningful enough, and beautiful enough to inspire lasting commitment. And that challenge leads directly to another difficult reality, one involving the very institutions responsible for preserving and transmitting the faith itself. The conversation about cultural decline, family formation, and spiritual confusion eventually leads to a subject many believers find difficult to discuss: the crisis within religious leadership itself. This is not a comfortable topic, and it should never be approached with bitterness or contempt. Yet history teaches that genuine renewal begins with honesty, not denial. Every generation of believers has faced moments when leaders failed to live up to their calling. The scriptures themselves are filled with examples. Prophets confronted kings, apostles corrected communities, saints challenged corruption. Their purpose was never to destroy the people of God, but to call them back to fidelity. Many observers believe that our own era has witnessed a similar struggle. The problem is not simply that mistakes have been made. Mistakes are inevitable wherever human beings are involved. The deeper concern is that large numbers of faithful people have become confused about what the church teaches, why it teaches it, and how those teachings should shape daily life. Over the past several decades, countless Catholics have experienced a weakening of doctrinal formation. Religious education often became less focused on transmitting the fullness of the faith and more focused on creating general feelings of belonging or community. While community is important, it cannot replace truth. A faith that is not understood deeply cannot be defended when challenged. The consequences of this weakness are visible in many areas. Large numbers of people no longer understand core teachings that previous generations considered fundamental. Practices that once occupied a central place in Catholic life have faded. Knowledge of Scripture, doctrine, and spiritual tradition has declined. In many places, entire generations have grown up without receiving the formation necessary to understand the richness of their own faith. Perhaps one of the most striking examples involves belief in the Eucharist. For centuries, the Eucharist stood at the center of Catholic life. It was not viewed merely as a symbol, but as a sacred reality deserving profound reverence and devotion. Yet surveys conducted in recent years suggest that many Catholics no longer fully understand or believe what the Church teaches about it. For many theologians, this is not a minor pastoral issue. It reflects a much larger crisis of catechesis and formation. When people lose sight of the sacred, they often lose sight of the purpose of faith itself. Adding to this challenge has been the devastating impact of scandals involving clergy abuse and institutional failures. The suffering endured by victims cannot be overstated. The betrayal of trust-damaged lives, families, and communities. It also weakened the credibility of religious leadership in the eyes of millions. Yet many spiritual writers caution against allowing these failures to become an excuse for abandoning the faith altogether. Human leaders may fail, sometimes in terrible ways, but the truth they were called to serve does not cease to be true because of their failures. History offers powerful reminders of this reality. The Church has survived periods of confusion, corruption, persecution, and division before. During the Arian crisis, vast portions of the Christian world embraced serious theological error. During other periods, corruption reached astonishing levels within ecclesiastical structures. Political powers attempted to suppress religious practice. Entire nations turned away from the faith, and yet the Church endured. Not because every leader acted courageously, not because every institution functioned perfectly. It endured because God continually raised up faithful men and women who refused to compromise. Again and again, renewal emerged from individuals who chose holiness when others chose convenience. Saints appeared during periods when many believed hope had vanished. They preserved the faith, strengthened communities, and inspired future generations. This pattern is important because it reminds us that every believer has a role to play. The future of the church is not determined solely by bishops, priests, theologians, or public figures. It is also shaped by ordinary people who choose faithfulness in their daily lives. The question facing believers today is not merely whether problems exist. The problems are obvious. The real question is how they will respond. Will they become cynical and withdraw? Will they surrender to discouragement? Or will they embrace the same path taken by countless saints before them? Deeper prayer, deeper commitment, deeper trust, and deeper fidelity. The answer to that question may determine not only the future of individuals and families, but also the future renewal of the church itself. And if renewal is to happen, it begins with rediscovering the spiritual tools that generations of believers once used to remain strong in times of trial.